On day 2 of the Champions Showdown Chess 960 event in St. Louis, there were blunders, there were brilliances, there was agony and ecstasy. Everything you would expect from rapid blitz and a 960 event where the baseline pieces are shuffled. Everything just gets a bit more random. So I'm going to show you 3 games in 3 separate videos. First of all, I want to catch up with what happened in the match between Vasilij Topalov and Garry Kasparov. Now, at the end of day 1, honours were roughly even. Topalov had won a rapid play game. Kasparov had won one of the Blitz games. So they went into day 2 and Kasparov, hoping that he could play himself into form. Of course, he's come out of retirement again, but he's not playing regularly at all, and that's very, very hard. So let's take a look at what happened in this rapid play game. Topalov is white, so let's look at the baseline. So the position was drawn an hour before they played, drawn by lots. So here we can see the rooks are in the starting positions for both colours, obviously. It's just the bishops and knights that are in slightly unusual positions. Obviously the king and queen slightly off centre as well. But yeah, the bishops and knights slightly oddly placed. So let's see how that plays out. So Topalov claimed the centre. This seems to be a common pattern, that these big guys, they don't play kind of flank openings. They like to plant a pawn in the centre. So this is kind of classical chess, you could say. And d5 from Kasparov, and Topalov breaks straight away in the centre. So now the pawn structure resembles something like a Caro-Kann or a Scandinavian. h6. Now that looks a bit weird at first, making a pawn move at the side of the board. In fact, it's a very logical move. It's been said by many players that you have to look after your bishops first in this chess 960 or Fischer random chess. That it's very easy to fix a pawn structure in a kind of normal way for a normal setup of pieces, but then the bishops get blocked in. So what Kasparov is doing by playing h6 is obviously to give the bishop a square. That means he can also castle to bring his rook from the corner as well. Knight in the middle, bishop h7, and now we can see that the pawn structure really is taking on that of a Scandinavian or a Caro-Kann. It's just really the pieces that are very oddly positioned, and of course at the moment the kings as well. Now this was, I have to say, a very, very tense game. So just a fairly quiet beginning, but just hang on and watch what happens. So yeah, Kasparov has castled. That's within the rules of chess 960, and both players just bring their piece out. So the bishop moves out, and that enables castling on this side of the board if white wants that. So the knight coming out, got to move off the back rank. You see, this is a position where you could fix the pawn structure to make it look like a normal pawn structure, but then look at that terrible knight blocked in by its own pawn. So that's why the knight has to come here first, which perhaps is a slightly odd position for the knight as well. And that obviously controls the f4 square, and the bishop coming off the back rank, and this one coming off the back rank as well. That bishop might pop out onto this diagonal, but just clearing the back rank. Queen c8, an interesting move. So Kasparov is spying that there are potential weaknesses on this diagonal that he might hop into. The bishop certainly does look good here. Okay, all fine so far. And now Kasparov makes, well, what to my eyes looks like a slightly odd move. In this position where black is a little bit cramped, I would expect just exchanging a pair of minor pieces and then putting that knight back to c7, where it might hop out to d5, but also it makes room for the e-pawn, perhaps to come to e6, maybe on a good day to even break with e5 at some moment. And it could be a queenside pawn advance. That looks normal to me. But instead, Kasparov plays knight g5, so he's going on a little adventure. I think he could see perhaps the potential for his queen to come to h3 or maybe to f5. But Topalov was not phased here. You'll notice that with the back rank clear here and here, then white is able to castle on either flank. It's very interesting. These are the chess 960 rules that take a little bit of getting used to. So kingside castling is possible here. But, well, typically Topalov played very adventurously. He decided to castle on the queen side. So now we have a real fight on our hands with kings on opposite sides of the board, which means that a pawn storm is easier to carry out for both players. But also it leaves that knight kind of dangling on this square. It's not really doing much on g5. Kasparov exchanged. And he started a pawn storm, which is fine. However, it allows this move, bishop takes knight, and h4. Now, Kasparov must have just underestimated this, because this is already extremely dangerous. If the h-file opens, then clearly white has just a stomping attack. But how Kasparov dealt with this is really interesting. He didn't panic. He just played g4, making sure the h-file stayed closed, so at the cost of a pawn, and that allowed him to carry on with his queenside pawn storm. So the pawn came to a3, and that opens up white's king a little bit, and he played b6. So the most important thing if you're attacking your opponent's king is to open files, open lines, open diagonals. So he wants to play c5. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, what's fantastic about Topalov is that he is fearless. He just believes in making the best moves. He's not concerned about his opponent's reputation in any way. So he doesn't blink in this position. He carries on with his own attack. h5. There's no question about trying to dampen down his opponent's initiative on the other side of the board. Just carry on. h5. Excellent policy. So Kasparov opens as well. Topalov exchanges one pair of pawns, and now h6 from Topalov. Very good move. Obviously he wants to open the position. And this takes a lot of guts, because you have to calculate the consequences of taking this pawn here. And I mean, this is possible for black to play like this. It's a real gamble. Objectively, white is actually doing extremely well in this position, but it's also very easy to go wrong. For example, if you take the rook, it turns out this is a mistake. And supposing white takes this, and b3 is a very powerful move with the idea takes a2. In fact, in this position, the best move is rook takes bishop. I mean, how one would determine that in a rapid play game it's really tough. It involves a lot of very precise calculations. So, for example, in this position, in fact, rook c8 is a very interesting move. And white would have to find this to trade pieces. Other sacrificial ideas don't actually work. And here, obviously, white is a piece up, but this is a very, very tricky position to deal with, because black is reasonably solid here. Objectively, better for white, but still very tricky. But Kasparov obviously took the view, must be losing somehow. I mean, his judgment was probably correct. So instead, he decides to close the position with bishop takes knight and g6. So the king side remains closed because The king can always, after the check, just come to h8, so the h file is blocked in a sense. And Kasparov is trying to open up the queen side, but Topalov passes, reacts very well, keeping it closed. So it's interesting how both sides are using the same technique to keep their own king position relatively safe. But the position is opening up, it's very double-edged. Around here, I felt that Kasparov was kind of finding his feet. But I have to say, Topalov played very coolly here. So this is an interesting move. Queen e3. You often see this in Sicilian positions, actually, that this queen, when the queen controls dark squares on both sides of the board, beautifully centralized, white is usually doing very well. It depends on the position, but it's a common theme in Sicilian positions. And actually this position now reminds me of the kind of Sicilian positions you get from Najdorfs and sometimes dragons as well, where the kings are on opposite sides. And often you get opposite colour bishops too. So Topalov, with this clever move Queen e3, is starting to support this b pawn actually. And so let's see how things progressed. And b6, the pawn marches on. I mean, maybe it should have been possible for Kasparov to halt that pawn's advance somehow, but it's tricky. And rook b5, excellent move from Topalov, just supporting that passed pawn. And from this moment on, Topalov plays excellently. So queen f3 keeps things nice and tidy. Might want to play rook h1 at some moment. Keeps an eye on f7. Also looks at the queen side too. Kasparov decides not to take that h pawn, but he might have regretted that decision later on in the game. Let's have a look. So Kasparov tries to get counterplay by advancing his kingside pawns, but as we'll see, that's a very risky strategy. Topalov finds a nice safe square for that rook on b4. So the b pawn is a permanent problem for Kasparov, and even though white's king is a little bit open, in fact Topalov, I think, holds the position together very, very nicely. King h8 and queen takes c4. So Toppy definitely looking good here. So Kasparov tries really his only chance to shake up the position, to advance the center pawns. But with the king so exposed here, I'm afraid white is definitely doing well. Bishop b3, excellent move. So queen g8 is threatened, and basically it's the end for black. Here, well, in time pressure, of course, Topalov missed a quick checkmate. He could have played queen and queen f7, checkmate. He's still winning. Rook b5 is a good move. And a check. And now the h-file is open and Topalov switches back to the king side with the queen for a checkmating attack. So obviously, you know, we have ideas of queen h3, and don't forget that bishop is on. Rook b5 I like actually. So black is just stretched here. It's over. Rook d3 prevents queen h3, but still queen g2, excellent move. So now there's rook h1 and potentially threats down the g file as well. On one of these squares something is going to land. Yeah, if rook g3, then we can check, and then, well, again, something disastrous is going to happen on the h file. Bishop f4 played, check. And here, well, Toppy got a new queen, and that really was the end of the game. Obviously, you know, after this, It's an extra rook, and it's going to be checkmate very, very soon somehow on one of these squares. So I think actually a very impressive game by Veselin Topalov, but you know, to see Garry Kasparov outplayed like that in the middle game, well, you know, at the height of his powers, I don't think we'd have seen that. But yeah, I don't want to take anything away from Topalov, who I think played a really superb game. But there were that moment in the opening, if I can go back to this position where Kasparov played knight g5. That's a real error of judgment, it seems to me, because the knight is just kind of on a slightly odd square. And just very quickly, let me show you what happened in one of their Blitz games. So the other rapid game was drawn. And this was, I think, the first Blitz game. The positions are around about even. Topalov with the white pieces. And I think this next move of Kasparov shows how he's just hasn't got the touch that he once had. Roughly level position. Kasparov with black now played rook f5, and that just feels like an odd move to me, because you can see that the rook is somehow slightly dominated by the knight, which it isn't with the position with the rook on f6. Also, it treads on the toes of the bishop. Now, this doesn't just offend aesthetically. There is, unfortunately for Kasparov, a tactical problem, because now the bishop is trapped. It can't retreat down the diagonal. Topalov won the bishop and Kasparov resigned. So again, Kasparov's touch, his feel in positions just isn't there. Poor guy. You know, if you're not match fit, you can have all the knowledge in the world. I think arguably Kasparov is, you know, the greatest player in the modern age. But yeah, to come out of retirement like this and to expect to play as well as he did, I don't think he has that expectation. But yeah, it's tough watching this, actually, I have to say. So Topalov won a rapid game, he won a blitz game, and the other two games were drawn. So Kasparov has fallen behind. I do hope that he manages to play himself back into some form. Do check out my other two videos looking at a couple of the other matches in St. Louis, and there's some really entertaining chess being played.